and honored to have Ambassador Mahbubani and Ambassador Roemer for our discussion on India, US, and China. In regards to Ambassador Mahbubani, I've known him for many, many years, since the 90s, and he's one of the sharpest minds in Asia, specifically on foreign policy. He was the ambassador to the UN. He was, the founding dean of Lee Kuan School of Public Policy, and you have to understand that's the only name the former Prime Minister, founder of Singapore, gave it to any institution itself. And he worked very closely with that Prime Minister in regards to defining policies for Singapore around the world. So Ambassador, we're delighted to have you. And then Ambassador Roemer, good to see you. You're looking good. And without any further due time, I'm going to hand it over to Ambassador Roemer, and they'll take it over to Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani. Ambassador Roemer.
Thank you, Mukesh. Great to see you. You're looking great with your books behind you. I'm tempted to peek and see what you're reading these days. But always a pleasure to see my friend who I got to know when I was in India, and we all have our copies. Our guest this morning, and I was perusing it all weekend and loved reading it, which I'm going to very much enjoy asking Kishore about. Before I get into that, thank you again, Mukesh, for your great leadership. You, John Chambers, your exemplary staff for not only the webinar this morning to look at China and US-India relations, global strategy around the world, but the work that you do every day to try to build up the relationship, the understanding, and move the U.S.-India relationship from more aspirational to strategic, long-term, and successful. So thank you again. As I get ready to kind of introduce what Mukesh has already introduced, Kishore Mahbubani, I'll be casual about this because Kishore and I, the ambassador, and I were talking for a few minutes before we got on the line this morning. He's a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute, a great, great place, widely respected in the world. The Singapore ambassador to the UN, 2 terms, 5 years and 5 years, almost the permanent, as they call it, the UN ambassador for Singapore, doing great work in his 2 tenure jobs there. And he started in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Singapore in 1971 and worked there through 2004. So he's got 3 distinguished careers. One in the Foreign Ministry as an ambassador. One as a academician and a writer, a scholar of many books, and now a policy advisor, somebody who looks at the world and tries to give out advice, smart strategic advice to those people looking and trying to glean a better understanding of especially the US-China relationship, but also how the US-India relationship is directly related to this in the global affairs today. Kishore, as I get ready to ask you the first question, and your book is excellent on this point, the need for a strategy, for a comprehensive strategy from the United States toward China. We look at 3 trends that are happening in the world today simultaneously with the COVID situation going on, which is rapidly digitalizing the economy, forcing businesses and business leaders to reassess their supply chains and where they're located. Nationalism and populism are also creating certain tensions for globalization and making people rethink that. And China's success in elevating people out of poverty, becoming one of the biggest economies in the world, that is certainly one of the key trends that you talk about in your book. Secondly, and more specifically, some of the trends coming from China itself, from President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party, the calibrated foreign policy to project regional and global supremacy, their One Belt, One Road policy, the highway technology, Huawei's efforts to promote 5G. Is that a threat? Is that an opportunity? The South China Sea militarization, the incarceration of the Uyghurs in the west of China, and the national security law in Hong Kong, among other things. All these things are creating tensions for the business community, the US business community in China. And then the third thing, Kishore, as you know, the US is struggling to put forward in the last few years a comprehensive strategy to deal with the changes in China. We initially embraced their elevation to the global economy, thought that they would open their economy and become more diverse and more democratic. That has not happened. But the United States has not adopted a comprehensive strategy, as you say in your book, to deal with the new China and Xi's more aggressive foreign policy. So I want to go at your final conclusion right away. We're lucky enough to have lots of people join us from their homes and businesses. We want to keep them attentive, and I want to hit you, Kishore, with one of the most important questions. At the end of your book, in your last chapter, you begin with the paradoxical conclusion: a major geopolitical contest between America and China is both inevitable and avoidable. What do you mean by that?
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and Mukesh, for that very generous introduction, and also for recommending my book to everyone. I'm very glad that you've read it carefully. You raised a lot of questions, but I'm going to start, in a sense, from the very beginning and talk about your first point about how the world is being challenged by COVID-19. And now we know how bad this challenge has been. And frankly, the global economy probably is in the worst shape probably since the Great Depression, and probably even more so than that. And one of the oldest rules of geopolitics is this: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so since COVID-19 is an enemy of the United States and COVID-19 is an enemy of China, if you follow the oldest rule of geopolitics, US and China should have come together and say, let's set aside our differences, let's fight our common enemy, COVID-19, let's destroy it, then we can go back to life as normal. And that would have been the normal thing to happen according to the oldest rule of geopolitics. But what is surprising is that instead of the US and China coming together to fight COVID-19, COVID-19 actually, in some ways, enhanced the geopolitical contest between US and China. And it sort of showed that the US-China geopolitical contest is a result of fundamental, deep structural forces that are driving this contest. And I just mentioned three very quickly. The first one, obviously, this is a 2,000-year rule that I think Graham Allison speaks about in his book, Destined for War. Whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which today is the United States, this has been true for 2,000 years. The world's #1 power always tries to push down the world's #1 emerging power. So in a sense, what the United States is doing vis-a-vis China is perfectly logical and could have been expected. And historians like Thucydides, as Graham Allison speaks about, would have said this is normal behavior. But there are other structural forces. And the second one is, of course, a much more delicate one. And Tim, you read the book, I touch upon a very delicate point, that in theory, geopolitics is driven just by reason and logic. But in practice, of course, emotions play a role. And in the case of China, as I say in my book, there's been buried in the Western subconscious for several hundred years, a fear of what I call the yellow peril. And that dimension, I think, is emotional, is real, in some ways explains the sort of emotional reactions to China's rise. And as you know, one of my big theses is that the United States doesn't seem to have a comprehensive strategy, and that's a result partly of emotions rather than reason and logic at play. And of course, the third structural force, and I think you hinted at this in your remarks, the United States expected that with its policy of engagement with China, United States was first open up China's economy, and after China opened up its economy, it would open up its political system, and China would become a democracy like the United States of America, and China and America would live happily ever after. But as you know, the opposite has happened. China is nowhere near becoming a democracy. In fact, its central authority is becoming even stronger than before under Xi Jinping. And so there's a real sense of disappointment in America that China hasn't transformed itself and become like America. But of course, I can tell you one point is that when future historians look at this, they may actually be puzzled that a country like the United States, which is less than 250 years old, with 1/4 of the population, expected that the United States would transform China, instead of China with a 4,000-year-old civilization with 4 times the population transforming the United States of America. So you can see how there are very different expectations on all these sides. But the result of this, of course, is that a major geopolitical contest has broken out. And I can confidently predict they'll carry on for the next 10, 20 years easily. But at the same time, as you know, I begin the book by saying it's a pity that the United States has launched this contest without first working out a thoughtful, comprehensive strategy on how to handle China. And as you know, as I say in the book, that insight was given to me after a one-on-one 2-hour lunch I had with Henry Kissinger at his private club, The Brook in New York. And I was actually a bit worried that he may not turn up that day because they were forecasting snow in the end of March 2018. But he turned up, wonderful guy. And we spent 2 hours just one-on-one in his private room. And it's very clear the message he was sending to me, you know, in this very subtle Kissingerian way, without saying things directly. You know? At the end of the message came through that, and I got his permission. I said, listen, I'm going to say in my book that the message I got from you was that America's biggest mistake is not to work out a comprehensive, thoughtful, long-term strategy. Do I have your permission? And he gave me his permission, so I put that paragraph in the book. And so one of the main goals of my book is to tell the United States, you know, that China is a much bigger challenge than the Soviet Union. Here, you're not dealing with a Johnny-come-lately Soviet Union, which was only created in 1919 or so. Here, you're dealing with a civilization that's 4,000 years old. It's the world's oldest continuous civilization. It's the only civilization that's been knocked down 4 times in 4,000 years and stood up every time. And the latest knock it got was very recently in a century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. And I mentioned the century of humiliation because the people who are the most motivated are the people who are often who've been humiliated, who feel this very deep sense of, you know, I will never again be humiliated. And that's a key driving force in China's behavior to the world. But at the same time, the Chinese also, and this insight, of course, is also from Kissinger in his book on China, the Chinese always think long-term and think strategically. And, you know, he compares, you know, in his book, Kissinger says the West plays the game of chess. You try to go for the quick kill, you kill the king and you win the game. The Chinese play the game of Go, Wei Qi. What they do is accumulate advantages over the long term. And then over time, things shift in their favor. They don't try and go there. And for the same reason, the Chinese also avoid military methods. And China is, you know, is the only one of the P5 members, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, US, Russia, UK, France, and China, that actually hasn't fought a war in 40 years. And even hasn't fired a gunshot in 30 years. And it's quite remarkable that the recent tragedy we had at the China-India border, where sadly so many people were killed, you know, so many soldiers were killed, China side, India side. They both surprisingly were very disciplined and said, we have a rule, don't use guns. Neither side use guns. Quite remarkable, that kind of strategic discipline. I mean, most people, when they get angry, they'll bring out their guns and start shooting. And it's quite, they were both sides are very disciplined. So you can see how the Chinese approach is very careful, patient, long-term. And the US approach, sadly, sometimes tends to be very impulsive without thinking through the consequences. So in my book, at the end of the day, my American friends who read the book, as you know, Tim, they wrote to me and said, thank you. You've actually explained to us why we need to reboot our strategy and come up with a fresh long-term perspective on how to manage China, because China has been around for 4,000 years and China will be around for another 4,000 years.
So both Henry Kissinger in his book on China and you in your book, Has China Won?, emphasize the critical need for a comprehensive strategy from the United States toward China. We know that some conflict is inevitable, as you say. It is inevitable because of this contrasting values that we have in our system in America and the Chinese system, but it's also avoidable. You touched on how we could cooperate with the Chinese on health and COVID-19, how we can cooperate on climate change, how we could cooperate on higher education, given some guardrails there. If you were advising the U.S. on a more comprehensive strategy, Kishore, what guardrails would you put around 3 or 4 issues so that there is an area of a friendly cooperation and there is also a strategy of fierce competition on the other hand, which is inevitable? How do we avoid the conflict?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, competition is the name of the game between countries. Competition is the name of the game between companies also. It's the nature of the life is in some ways. But at the same time, you know, when if this competition is going to happen, when the United States joined the competition against the Soviet Union, it was fortunate to have been advised by someone whom you know well, Tim, as you know, George Kennan, probably one of the greatest strategic thinkers that America has produced. And what's interesting is that when the United States took on a challenger like Soviet Union, which is a much smaller in relative term challenger than China is, it worked out a very comprehensive, thoughtful, long-term strategy. And he heeded the advice of George Kennan. Let me just give you 4 pieces of advice that George Kennan gave. The first thing he said, at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest will not depend on the number of guns and bombs that we have. It will depend, at the end of the day, on the spiritual vitality of our society. So if American society is seen to be more vibrant, more dynamic, more productive, more industrious, we will win the contest, right? And so, here, that advice is not being heeded, because in the last 30 years, the average income of the bottom 50% in America has gone down over a 30-year period. And at the same time, the Chinese have had the best 40 years in terms of improving living standards in 4,000 years. So if Kennan were alive today, he says, why is Chinese society more vibrant and more dynamic economically than American society? So that's one area he would point to. Secondly, George Kennan said, cultivate friends and allies. And sadly, as you know, Trump has alienated even the closest European allies. The third thing he said, don't insult your adversaries. And he said, don't insult Soviet Union because you've got to work with them at some point in time. And unfortunately, the Trump administration, again, has been insulting China. And I agree with you that Biden will be different. And then the fourth thing is, he said, be humble. That's what Kennan said. And unfortunately, that humility is gone now. So all these pieces of advice that George Kennan gave to Soviet Union on how to handle Soviet Union in 1949 are still valid today in 2020, and they should be applied. And I think if the United States applied that, it will be a better outcome. And I would say the most, when you talk about guardrails, that was a key question. The first question that US needs to ask is, what is our primary strategic goal? And I would say the primary strategic goal of the United States should be to improve the well-being of its people, to stop this downward slide of the bottom 50%. And if that's the case, if the primary goal of the US is to improve the well-being of its people, especially the bottom 50%, and if the primary goal of China, whose per capita income is still only 1/6 that of the United States, to get rid of poverty and improve the well-being of its people, there's no necessary contradiction between these two strategic goals. And the second guardrail I'll put in, Tim, is that today we live in a world where increasingly, as a result of the world becoming so small, so globalized, so interconnected, the biggest problems that we face today are global problems. They're not national problems. I mean, COVID-19 has basically taught us that we live in a small interconnected world. Global warming has taught us we live in a small interconnected world. And that's why, as you know, in my second last page, Tim, of my book, I say that if the US and China keep fighting each other, right, while global warming is happening, future historians will see them as two tribes of apes fighting each other while the forest around them was burning. Now, if the forest around you is burning, logically you should come together and put out the fire first. Because there's no point if you win the fight and the forest burns you up, right? What fight are you winning if the forest is going to kill you anyway? Doesn't make sense. So it logically, rationally, like in dealing with COVID-19. So what the US and China needs to do is work out this very careful balance of competition and cooperation, you know, between the two. And I think that's the best way to manage the relationship in the coming decades, because in some areas, actually, the American people will be better off if they cooperated with China in some areas. And for example, let's take, you know, like infrastructure. You know, I've taken the Acela fast train from Boston to New York, and I've taken the fast train from Shanghai to Beijing. I mean, it's amazing. The difference is unbelievable. I couldn't tell whether the United States was a developed country or China was a developed country. The infrastructure in China today is amazing. It reminded me of the United States I knew when I first went there in the 70s. You know, that's what China portrays today, and frankly, United States can do with a big infrastructure investment. So there are areas where, if you're logical and rational, you compete in some areas, but you cooperate in other areas.
So it's amazing, I think, Kishore, that in your research on George Kennan, who many people would feel is the author of the X article, that was the famous article in American Foreign Policy. Many people thought that Kennan was militaristic, that he was the hawk, that he was the advocate of building up and up and up the defense budget. Instead, what you're saying, and what George Kennan said in his own words, was the internal factors in the United States, domestic factors, will determine who wins the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, not so much the external factors. Given that he said that, and let's fast forward now to the US-China relationship, given your point on developing a strategic policy here, technology is going to be a fundamental important issue for both the US economy and for the Chinese economy. I argue in one of the pieces that I've recently written that the United States and China are headed for a code war, not a Cold War, but a code war based on artificial intelligence, chip manufacturing, capabilities in computing and higher tech. And that all of these technologies can't necessarily be cooperative and shared, given the intrusive nature of it and given the way that this technology is sometimes used. So how do we encourage our US businesses to, come back home, or, if there's a new supply chain, to reshore it in the United States or someplace else? We know that businesses are not going to leave China, but new supply chains might be located in different places. How do we manage this relationship with China on competition and on cooperation, but separate some of the technology and have that be in the competition sphere more than the cooperation?
Yeah, oh, very, very good question. So, by the way, just another quick footnote on George Kennan, just to illustrate how wise he was. As you know, he was alive actually at the time of the Iraq War. He must have been close to 100, I think, at that point in time. And he advised against the Iraq War because, he knew that the United States was going to waste a lot of money and treasure in a war that wasn't necessary for American interests. And at the end of the day, the war was, by the way, a geopolitical gift to China because it kept the United States down. He also advised against no first use of nuclear weapons, again, emphasizing it's not the military dimension that matters. So that's how wise he was. But on the technology question, I suspect you're much more of an expert on it than I am, Tim. But the best way to manage this technological war, in my view, especially the things on cyber warfare and other things like that, is to create multilateral rules that work for everybody and find ways and means of nudging towards compliance. Because at the end of the day, this technology war doesn't just involve United States, China, it also involves Europe, it involves Japan, it involves India, it involves the rest of the world. And I think from the point of view, especially from the smaller states and other states, they don't want to be caught in a situation where they are forced to choose, you know. They just want the best technology that works. And they rather have a set of international rules on what you should, what you can or cannot do in these areas, and try to have them, if possible, inspected and maintained by some kind of neutral international body. So as you know, in many areas, we have actually worked out sets of rules for planes to fly through the sky, for ships to go through the open waters, for trade to cross borders. So over time, this has been the biggest gift of the United States and the Western powers to the world after 1945. You know, the entire 1945 rules-based order was a generous gift from United States, essentially to the rest of the world. You created the UN, you created the IMF, you created the World Bank, you created the World Trade Organization. So in a sense, what I'm advocating is that you create a world cyber organization and try to work with that organization and find a set of rules that everybody can live with. Of course, in some areas, for national security reasons, you're going to protect your technology, and that's understandable. But in other areas where it is not part of your national security, you can create a set of rules and say, these are the do's and don'ts, or what you can agree to. So that's what I would advocate, Tim.
So Kishore, let's move to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, and you spent some time in your book talking about. I fully embrace this and agree that we need to do a better job in the United States on this part, and that is forming partnerships in the world. You talk in your book about the soft power the United States utilized and leveraged in the 1960s and 70s and 80s really led to a predominance of American power worldwide. That soft power was essential to its messaging and its might. Our relationship with India at times is aspirational, but we've also, through many administrations, Republican and Democratic, going back to the Clinton administration through Bush and Obama, we've been able to deepen the defense relationship, expand intelligence sharing, look at the Indo-Pacific as an area of mutual concern and safety and freedom of navigation. We've been doing this time and time again with India, but there are hurdles with the U.S.-India relationship. How would you assess that U.S.-India relationship? What can we do to improve that as China is pounding on India's border these days and causing great concern there?
Well, you know, it's not an easy question to answer, because I think one of I mentioned the rules of geopolitics. I should also mention that geopolitics is a very cruel game. And, you know, you can end up, you know, on the wrong side. And just to give you illustrate, in the Cold War, as you know, it was the United States and China and Pakistan on one side, and Soviet Union and India on the other side. And that was a outcome of geopolitics. And that was a bit odd, because the United States was actually partnering the world's largest communist country against the world's largest, China against the world's largest democracy, which was India. But this happens in geopolitics. But of course, geopolitics has now shifted, and clearly it has created a geopolitical sweet spot for India. Because India is going to become, in some ways, the most courted country in the world. Be courted by United States. I think we had a problem with China, but China, as you know, has also been courting India, and Europe will be courting India. So there'll be lots of geopolitical opportunities for India in this coming game. And I think India's got to learn to, what India needs basically is a man like Henry Kissinger, who can be very careful and calculating in deciding what the best options for India are. And for a country like India, it can actually certainly develop a much, much closer relationship with the United States than it has in the past, and with Europe and other powers too. But United States, when it comes to India's relations with the United States, this is a bit tragic. China decided to engage the United States in 1971. And then it had a honeymoon relationship for 20 years, China and United States, at a time when United States was very strong, self-confident, powerful, and generous. So it opened its borders to Chinese products, and in the end, they welcomed China in the World Trade Organization. But now, India has decided to engage the United States at a time when the United States is no longer feeling as strong and as self-confident, as open as it used to be. So for example, in the week in which the Indian soldiers were killed at the border with China, that same week, the Trump administration canceled, I don't know how many thousand H-1B visas. And the country that was the most badly affected was India, because H-1B visas are basically, in some ways, India's gift to America is H-1B visas. So India is sending its best brains to America. And that will be a win-win partnership. But the politics of the United States has changed so much that the kind of generosity that the United States showed towards China in the 1970s, when the United States and China had a love affair, that kind of generosity is no longer possible for any American leader, because as you know, any American leader that is seen to give away American jobs to foreigners is in trouble in the world of today. So I think India has got to recognize that this is a different world from the one that existed 30, 42 years ago. So there are opportunities vis-a-vis the United States, but there are also opportunities vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And I want to add one other point vis-a-vis the United States. You know, if India gravitates towards becoming an ally of the United States, which is an option, you know what the allies of the United States are expected to do is to change their voting position at the United Nations on many issues. The United States measures the degree of convergence. And right now, the degree of convergence in terms of voting at the UN within India and the United States is actually quite low on many issues, Middle East issues, and so on and so forth. So there are many changes that have to happen in that dimension too. But I can tell you, I suspect it would also serve America's interests to have a close, trusting relationship with India, but an India that is also independent. And an independent India can sometimes be a more useful partner for the United States, can get things done for the United States in a way that an ally cannot get done. So you see that this is the nature of geopolitics, and what you can do with it. So I think that is one factor that India needs to bear in mind. But I certainly, the opportunities for India today are far greater than they have ever been.
And I agree, Kishore, that maybe with India's sensitivity to the word alliance, that partnership is a way to smooth that over. There's also, the issue that we worked on when I was in India as a U.S. ambassador, the Quad relationships, where Japan and Australia and the United States and India would all work together on defense sharing and exercises and so forth. So it wasn't termed an alliance so much as a global partnership that India was more comfortable with, more settled with, and could sell domestically to their audience. I think we have to think in more creative terms for deepening the strategic relationship with India. We've talked about the U.S. Strategic mistake, not developing a strategy for China. What is China's biggest strategic mistake, Kishore?
Well, Tim, as you know, I have a chapter in the book devoted to China's biggest strategic mistake. And this was a completely unnecessary mistake on the part of China, which is to alienate the American business community. And as you know, when after China opened up and engaged the United States and opened up its economy, it found very quickly that its strongest supporters of engagement with the US and China was the American business community, because many of the large corporations, of course, discovered that China was an incredibly big market for them. And you just take two of America's biggest companies. For Boeing, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the China market grew up to about 25% of Boeing sales, you know. So one country, 25% of the sales. So that, and by the way, the market for Boeing in China is going to become even bigger, because the number of Chinese that are going to be able to fly after COVID-19 is over will be amazing. Will be the world's biggest aviation market. And so Boeing's got to have a place in it. And then for General Motors, I think at one stage, General Motors was making more money selling cars in China than it was selling cars in America. So all these companies benefited from the Chinese market and therefore quite naturally lobbied on behalf of China. And whenever the US government wanted to do something against China, they would pick up their phones, call up the congressmen, call up the senators and say, stop, stop, stop. We have a huge market in China. But what's interesting is that when President Donald Trump decided to launch his trade war against China in 2017, not one American company spoke up. They all kept quiet. They all said privately, go right ahead, President Trump. And as you know, the only issue on which President Trump gets bipartisan support is when he attacks China and then starts the trade war. So this shows how much the Chinese have eroded the support of their strongest constituency. And of course, this is a result of many factors. Certainly after 2008, 2009, global financial crisis, the Chinese clearly became arrogant. And their arrogance was to some extent a result of when they saw how badly the United States was hit by 2008, 2009. And actually, I happened to be in Beijing, amazingly enough, on the very day when a friend of mine told me a US Treasury has sent a delegation to Beijing to plead with Beijing, please don't stop buying US Treasury bills. Because if you stop buying Treasury bills at the height of the financial crisis, the markets would have tanked even more. And so once the Chinese got a appeal from the US Treasury, they said, I'm big shot now. I'm strong. I can do what I want. So they became arrogant. They forgot the advice of George Kennan to be humble. In fact, Deng Xiaoping also told them, be humble. So I think this arrogance floated down, and certainly at the ground level, many American companies had lots of problems. They were forced to share technology. There was theft of intellectual property, and there were various other problems that they had. So this created a groundswell of resentment towards China. And so when the trade war began, you notice that, to the best of my knowledge, except for maybe Henry Kissinger in a very subtle way, trying to say, be careful, almost everybody else has kept absolutely quiet. And no voices have spoken out in the United States saying, hey, let's think about what are the benefits and costs of this, what we're trying to do.
It's an excellent point, Kishore, that the U.S. business community has soured to some degree in the relationship with China for cyber reasons, intellectual property theft reasons, the mood of the way they're treated by the Chinese government at times. When we see surveys of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, those surveys come back at higher and higher levels of disgruntled anger and behavior. I would, I wonder if there's a way that, that's repaired, changed in the long term. Just as an aside, you mentioned the H-1B visas and the difference there for India. Now, India comes to the United States and invests in high-paying jobs, creates those through Wipro and Infosys and other companies coming to the U.S. They need to be able to brand themselves as doing that and helping the U.S. recover in this coma that we've been in, COVID-19 coma, whereby the sales that the American businesses, What's your advice to American businesses then, Kishore, on how to handle Chinese government and where to go in the future with this? What role do they play in helping the U.S. government develop this strategic policy that you say is so essential? And I agree.
Well, I would say there is actually now, paradoxically, as relations between US and China get worse, and they will get worse, the Chinese will still try their best to minimize this contest with United States, and they realize the mistakes that they have made vis-a-vis American business. So I suspect they're going to bend over backwards to make it easier for American businessmen to invest in China. And they may invest in China either directly or indirectly. And I'll tell you a story. And this is off the record, right, Tim? There's no press, right?
Yep.
Okay, so
I think they're recording it, Kishore. So I think you do have to. You need to be careful in your words.
okay, then I wouldn't mention the name of the company. I'll just say a major American company has decided that the market for its products is clearly going to be in China, because China is developing the world's largest middle class. But they also realize that if they're an American company in China, they could be hit by China and they could be hit by United States for saying, hey, why are you investing in China? So what they did was that they went to Kazakhstan and they set up a company in which they have 49% ownership, but total management control. And they're setting up a massive factory there, massive. And that factory has only one market, China. So this American company therefore decided, yes, we will grow from the Chinese market, but we will not go there directly. We will be just outside. And Kazakhstan and China have some preferential trading arrangements, and they'll get their products into the Chinese market. So there are lots of American companies, the really big ones, who it could be Starbucks, McDonald's, and others that can find opportunities still in the Chinese market. And so if I was an American businessman, of course, I'd be very careful about intellectual property and all those things, but I would not give up on the China market. And as you know, in some areas, actually, China is actually liberalizing even more. And so, if you are in the finance sector, insurance sector, investment banking sector, China is going to become a much more welcoming environment for investments in that area. And the Chinese capacity to take risks to open up their economy now today may be second to none. I'll give you a concrete example. You know, when Obama signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was a brilliant geopolitical move on the part of Obama, because what he was doing is that he was anchoring the presence of the United States in East Asia. And everybody in East Asia said, great, this is one way we'll keep the United States in the region forever. But and that would have been, in a sense, United States' answer to the big Chinese market. That would be the big TPP market, including Japan and Australia and others. But when the Trump administration pulled out, that TPP should have collapsed, but the Japanese surprisingly took the leadership. And when they took the leadership, they kept it going. And then a few weeks ago, the Premier of China, Li Keqiang, said, well, maybe China can join the CPTPP. Now, the CPTPP is a very high order trade agreement, It requires a lot of compliance in many difficult areas. The fact that China is saying it is ready to join is actually quite a very bold thing for China to do, So that's an example of how things are turning around. And therefore, what this means is that there will be all kinds of opportunities for American business still in China. And by the way, in the rest of Asia too.
I found on your book, on page 257, you talk about the importance of diplomacy and expertise, which I completely was absorbed in, Kishore. I do believe that if you're going to form partnerships, if you're going to use soft power effectively, you need experienced people, diplomats, foreign servants that are going to engage in this and know how to do it. Obviously, you spent over 30 years in the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Singapore. You talk on page 257 about the importance of this experience and expertise between Nixon, Kissinger, Mao, and Zhou Enlai, that they trusted each other, that they knew about their different cultures and civilizations and respected those cultures, and therefore could pull off this historic breakthrough. Given that kind of assessment, how would you assess the relationship between President Xi and President Trump these days?
Well, that's a source of great mystery. Surprisingly, I mean, and by the way, one of my sources is John Bolton in his latest book, as you know, which I'm sure
Has
many
he
of
mentioned you in his new book?
No, I've only read parts of it. I've seen parts of it. At least I've seen the extracts of it. But he points out that at the personal level, the chemistry between Xi and Trump is not bad. That they actually do get along okay with each other. But there isn't the same kind of deep understanding of history, culture. You know, Kissinger and Nixon, Kissinger is and Nixon was, are very thoughtful thinkers, you know. They actually read a lot and struggled very hard to understand the country that they are dealing with. And of course, as you know, when I joined the Foreign Service 50 years ago in 1971 in Singapore, I wouldn't bother talking to Chinese diplomats because they wore Maoist jackets and had Mao's little red book in their pocket. And they would read to me Mao's red book. Why should I waste my time with a Chinese diplomat? Whereas the American diplomats were very suave, sophisticated, read the New Yorker, read the New York Times, were very well informed, and with a great joy to be with, you know. But you fast forward 50 years, the State Department has never been so demoralized as it is today, as you know. And also, by the way, I was also going to mention, you know, Tim, you're connected with APCO. There were also congressmen who were very sophisticated. One of my good friends was Steve Solas. I don't know whether you ever knew him, Congressman Steve
Oh,
Solas.
sure, I knew Steve, and he worked at APCO worldwide.
Exactly, and he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he played a critical, he and I worked closely together to reverse the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. And it was a real joy to work with him because he was so super smart and amazing, you know. So you had the quality of mind of Americans involved in diplomacy was clearly the best in the world, you know. That was 30, 40, 20, even 20 years ago, but it's really slid down very badly. And I was, as you know, one of my key recommendations in my book is that the United States should actually spend less in its defense budget. In fact, it's defense, the more that America spends on defense, the more it's a gift to China. Because it's using money on weapons that will not be used. There'll be no war between US and China because in a nuclear war, you don't have a winner and a winner and loser, you have a loser and a loser. So there'll be no nuclear war between the United States and China. So you don't spend money on defense, spend money on diplomacy. And that's where the United States can win very big.
Well, you do mention in your book that the United States has spent over $5 trillion in wars in the Middle East, which they could have spent domestically on addressing this disparity in income between the richest and poorest. Let me ask you another question about the Indo-Pacific region, Kishore, while we have you. And your perspective from that region is key. Australia and China have been increasingly taking more hostile actions against one another. Australia initially said they wanted to investigate the origins of the COVID-19 crisis. China didn't like that. China retaliated with some soybean cancellations of Australian, products. It escalated even more, maybe some cyber attacks from China on Australia. And then Australia just recently announced that it was buying, missiles, cyber equipment, and protective high-tech equipment on the defense side from the United States. And most people assume that this is all pointed at China. Some people worry this could be an arms race in the Indo-Pacific area. How do you assess China's aggressiveness? Some people say hostility towards some of its neighbors. Would she ever admit that this is a mistake, that he's losing soft power effectiveness in the region? Is this something that the United States should take advantage of, and how?
Yeah. Well, let me quickly just reinforce your point about $5 trillion. This is the figure that an independent study has done. The United States spent $5 trillion on post 9/11 wars. And if that $5 trillion had been given to the bottom 50% in America, each member of the bottom 50% in America would have received a check for $30,000. That would be amazingly helpful to people at the bottom 50%. So that was money down the drain. As you know, that's why George Kennan advised against those wars. Now, it is absolutely true. Going back to your point about China and the neighbors, it's absolutely true that China's rise has caused at least discomfort, some cases concern, some cases alarm among all his neighbors. And when the Chinese ask me why, I say it's very simple. Here am I talking to you. I noticed a little cat there sitting there happily, and I'm happy with the cat there. It looks very friendly. I might touch it sometime. Then after I've been talking to you for 1 hour, I turned around. There's a tiger there now. My God, I'm sharing a room with a tiger now.
Are you still petting it?
Yeah, so that's what China has grown to become. I mean, China's economy, it's important to remember the statistic. In 1980, China's economy was, in PPP terms, 10% of the United States, 10%. Today, in PPP terms, it's larger. So can you imagine whichever creature is next to you has grown 10 times in size? So obviously you're worried. So even if it's the nicest animal, even if it's an elephant, all the elephant needs to do is step the wrong way and you're gone, you're dead. So clearly the concern about China has grown. And it's also true that there have been lots of missteps by China in this region, missteps on the South China Sea, and certainly I think it handled Japan badly. But Australia, I would say, is a mixed story. To some extent, this is what my Australian friend tells me also, that even if Australia wanted to push for the independent investigation in WHO, would have been wiser to get somebody else to front it or do it with somebody else. Don't stick out. There's an old rule, the nail that sticks out is the one that gets knocked. And as you know, in my book, I discussed the strategic dilemma that Australia will have, because its defense, its politics, its culture is tied like almost all the way with the United States. But its economy its biggest trading partner is China. And I think about 30% of its exports go to China. So the Australians will be very torn when this happens. So clearly, China needs to show much greater sensitivity in the handling of its neighbors. And even in the ASEAN region, for example. In my book, I discussed the 10 Southeast Asian countries. And by the way, I want to mention, Tim, in case I haven't, that the Southeast Asia is actually one of the most remarkable parts in the world, because out of 650 million people, it's the most diverse corner of planet Earth. You have over 200 million Muslims, 150 million Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists. You have 150 million Christians. You have Hindus, Taoists, Confucianists, and Communists. Southeast Asia is the most diverse corner of planet Earth. And it's developed the second most successful regional organization, ASEAN. But in this region, it's important for Americans to know that there are huge reservoirs of goodwill in ASEAN towards the United States of America. And America has invested more in ASEAN in financial terms than it has in China, Japan, or Korea. And nobody knows that in America, by the way. So there are reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States in many parts of the world that the US can still work with. And certainly if I was a US diplomat, I would be saying, hey, there's a rising level of concern with China. Now let me see how I can play a more constructive role here. But at the same time, as you know, I emphasize in the book that no country wants to be forced to choose between China and the United States. In fact, the vast majority of the countries in the world want to work with the United States, and they want to work with China. They want to grow their economies, and they don't want to be caught in this battle. So if any American administration says you're with us or against us, then you'll discover that very few countries, unlike the one with the Soviet Union, will stand up and say, yes, we are with you all the way. So this requires a much more sophisticated, nuanced American diplomacy.
Well, your point about ASEAN countries is a very key and seminal one. When President Obama sent me to represent our country to Delhi as U.S. ambassador, one of the many things that he said in the rebalance to Asia, the increased importance on a strategic relationship with India, and the emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, was to reach out to the ASEAN countries. And he actually had me travel to many ASEAN countries to try to find ways to cooperate and to encourage India to speak up on regional issues in favor of the ASEAN perspective. I want to sum up here, Kishore. You've been just great. This has just been a fabulous hour. It's flown by. Your insights have been marvelous. I want to talk about your book one last time and hit you with the last question. The Chinese challenge to American primacy. Has China won? You say they win round one. What is your advice in round 2 and 3 and 4 for America and finally getting this strategy put together? What happens next?
Well, actually, the answer, the real answer I give in my book, has China won? And I should not give the answer, otherwise people will not buy the book. It's actually no, or more accurately, not yet. But if the Chinese adopt a patient, long-term strategy of accumulating assets, and the United States reacts impulsively without a comprehensive long-term strategy and not heeding Kissinger's advice, then I think the likelihood is that China will end up being stronger and more formidable power. But I would say the United States still has a tremendous opportunities in this coming world, because the United States does not have to push the military dimension of this contest, because that's not necessarily why things are going to be worked out. What the United States should emphasize that it is, as a country, still far more attractive to the rest of the world. The reason why, for example, the most successful ethnic Indian community anywhere in the world is the United States. And it's quite remarkable that in the most competitive human laboratory in the world, which is the United States, the most successful ethnic community is the ethnic Indian community. It's amazing, so it shows you how, no major Chinese corporation is run by anybody born outside China. But United States, Google, Microsoft, they're run by people born in India, So clearly this is something that's special about the United States. So United States should be selling a positive message about itself to the rest of the world. And that's how the United States will win this game. Going back to Cannon and say, rebuild the spiritual vitality and the domestic vibrancy of American society. That's the most critical factor for America to win.
Well, Ambassador, it has been a pleasure. You have been enlightening, informed, and very, very interesting over the course of the past hour. Your book, I recommend it for everybody to read, to stimulate their thinking about one of the most important relationships in the world, the U.S.-China relationship, and also, as I always firmly believe, the U.S.-India relationship is critical, both in this context, but also in its own right. I remember in my first orientation up to Harvard University as a newly elected member of Congress, Ambassador, And the former Speaker of the House came in, Tip O'Neill, a large man with big white hair, lint falling out of his pockets, and he spoke to us and he said to us, freshman members of Congress, make sure you travel the world to understand what's happening in different parts of the world. Don't just read it in a book or think you're going to understand it from TV. You have brought the perspective of many decades of diplomacy here to all of the lucky people to watch you this morning. You have given us great advice about the need for a strategy in our formal foreign policy, our formal foreign policy, to adopt that, to implement and execute on that. And I feel like we've taken a trip with you this morning to have a perspective from Singapore and from a key part of the world to see how the U.S. is viewed in this U.S.-China relationship. So thank you again. This has just been very enjoyable for me, and I look forward to your next book.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have to say namaste. You cannot shake hands.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time. I know it's late in Singapore, but it's good to see you after many, many years. And I will be in touch separately. Once again, thank you. And Ambassador Roemer, thank you for moderating the session. Ambassador, besides being a friend, he's also on our board of USISPF. So thank you to both of you, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.